Welcome everybody to today's webinar. For those of you joining us for the first time, this is a series of monthly webinars brought to you by the Tennessee Urban Forestry Council and the University of Tennessee's Residential and Community Forestry Working Group, where our purpose is to offer you a wide range of topics that can improve our understanding of the importance of trees in our daily lives, and also how we can better provide for a healthy urban forest. Now, my name is Neil Letson. I'm the past president of the Tennessee Urban Forestry Council, and also want to introduce Elisa Mercker. She's in the background there somewhere, but she's a communication specialist with UT at Knoxville, I believe with the School of Forestry, Wildlife, and Fisheries, but she's the one that kind of pulled all the strings together to make this technically possible. Appreciate her. Our topic today is a very interesting one for me, is titled very graphically, How Trees Die, and how we can improve our understanding of basic tree physiology. So it's a very important topic, one we've never touched on, but I think is valuable for those of us who care about trees and are looking for ways to better care for them. But before we start, there are a couple of housekeeping items I want to go over, and Elisa, if you'll help me with the slides here. There we go. Some of you are watching this, are looking to get qualify at least for 1 hour or CEU through the International Society of Arboriculture. If you submitted your Southern Chapter or ISA certification number during the registration, then you don't have to worry about that. Just as long as you stay online throughout the presentation, we will take care of it from there and add your name and number to the list that we'll submit to ISA. Now, if you didn't, Elisa, I guess they can just send in through the chat room what that number is and their name, and then she'll make sure you get credit, but only as long as you stay on the program to the very end. Now, if you have any questions, we are going to provide a Q&A session after our presentation today so that we don't interrupt the train of thought of our speaker. We're just asking you to enter those questions in the chat room, and when the presentation is completed, we'll provide some time for Elisa to read out those questions so our presenter can answer them for you. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. David Mercker, who is a professional forester, and it's hard to tell when you look at him, for 36 years, 13 in the private sector and 23 in his current role as extension forester with the University of Tennessee. Now, David's primary involvement has been educational programs for landowners, loggers, foresters, teachers, those involved in sustainable forest management. He has a wealth of experience in doing that, and I personally have attended some of his presentations, and he has a talent for translating the technical into layman's terms. So he's a very talented presenter and educator. He is also a fellow with the Society of American Foresters, has received honors including the National Family Forest Education Award, and a couple of years ago in 2020 actually was awarded the National Extension Forester of the Year, and a very prestigious award. He is adopted to the social media very well. He has a series of educational videos titled Back Porch Forestry, and you ought to Google that, Back Porch Forestry, if you want to learn more about forest management. Very informative, which offers education in a non-formal setting. So with that, David, we're glad to have you on board. Are you still there, hopefully?
I'm still here.
Okay, well, good. I will say before I turn it over to you, David, that I worked in Alabama for 33 years in forestry, and I used to get the Treasure Forest magazine, excellent landowner magazine, and you were one of the featured articles on a number of topics, and very informative, very layman oriented, and I just wanted to personally appreciate the articles you did there for our state when I was still in Alabama. But anyway, Dave, we're glad to have you on board, and we're going to turn it over to you.
Very good, Neil. Let me share the screen. I appreciate that introduction. I think some of those accolades just means I'm getting long in the tooth. at this point, been around a while. So it's great to see everyone, albeit virtually today. I wanted to share this initial slide. This is the West Tennessee Research and Education Center in Jackson, where I'm located. If you haven't had a chance to come visit us, please do sometime. There's a lot to see out here and a lot of education that is being taught out this way. So Neil mentioned that this presentation, that I developed a series of presentations on YouTube under the title Back Porch Forestry. And so these kind of originated out of the COVID work at home era. And so today's presentation is on there. It'll be an abbreviated version of it, but there's about 25 presentations on there. Most of them deal with forest management rather than urban forestry, but there are some that would be related and perhaps would be interested to this audience today. I want to make a qualifying statement as we begin, or a disqualifying statement, and that is that I'm not an arborist. I am a forester. I'm not a tree physiologist either. And so my expertise and interest and knowledge lies in working in rural areas with forested tracts, educating landowners on sustainable forest management. But you sure pick up a lot through the years related to just trees in general. And so that's what brings us to this presentation today. So a number of years ago, I was asked this particular question: why do trees die? And it kind of rocked me back on my heels a little bit because I never really thought about that. We understand a lot about how they grow, but the question how they die is a different situation. And so today I'm going to be addressing that particular question. That question actually led to this PowerPoint that you're seeing today, but it also led to a publication by the very same title, Why Do Trees Die? It's located online, and I will give you the URL at the end of this presentation for those that want to delve a little bit deeper. So why do trees die? This is an introduction to tree physiology. And I want to begin just with some opening remarks, if you will, that will help us kind of set the stage for this presentation. I want to talk briefly about tree parts. I think probably many in your audience understand this, but I'll begin at the top and go clockwise. The terminal, of course, refers to the leader, or the very tip part of the tree. That's a very important part of the tree, naturally, because that's where expansion is constantly occurring, and then the leader that follows it. As you come down around the right side, you'll see live crown length. I prefer to call that live crown ratio, and that's the portion of total tree height that has living branches. Now, that might not seem important, but it's very important. There's a direct correlation between the growth rate of a tree and the health of the tree based on how high of a live crown ratio it has. So in yard settings, typically our trees have a high live crown ratio. If they're 50 feet tall and 25 feet in branches, it would have a 50% live crown ratio. But in a forest setting, as the forest develops, that live crown ratio shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. And that's when trees begin to decline or slow down and grow. Coming down the bottom, you'll see three different types of roots. We've got the tap root that anchors the tree, the lateral roots that emerge from that, and then springing forth from the lateral roots are these root fans. Those are really, really, really critical and oftentimes overlooked just because they're small. But these are like the worker bees that do a lot of the work. They're constantly springing forth to try to find new sources of water, oxygen, and fertility as well. Coming around the left side, then we have the trunk or the bole or the stem. This is the part that as a forester I'm interested in. This is the wood fiber that we're growing for the 8 billion people on this planet. And so that's what foresters are constantly concerned about. And then you'll see lateral branches. So continuing with some introductory comments then, I want to just briefly talk about points of expansion. Where is a tree growing essentially? And it grows from three basic regions. There are the root tips, of course, constantly foraging through the soil, trying to find what they need to survive. There are buds, of course, that emerge too. And then there's the cambium layer, which is the growth in girth. So we like to say that the first two are primary growth, and this second one then is secondary growth. So secondary growth can't occur until we have growth from the root tips and the buds first. So expanding then on the cambium layer, if you look at it from this perspective, the cross section, most of us probably remember this from high school biology, but you can see the cambium, and this is microscopic, it's enlarged here. But each spring of the year, the cambium actually begins dividing through mitosis two different directions, which is kind of fascinating to think that something that's veneer that's wrapped around the tree is growing both inward and outward simultaneously. So as it grows inward, it's producing new wood cells. We know new wood as xylem. Old wood would become heartwood. And so the function of xylem is to carry water and nutrients up. Think of it as long, giant straws going from the roots of the tree all the way up to the branch tips, carrying this water up and the nutrients up. So because it's going up, we say xy high. As I mentioned, old xylem then becomes heartwood. So the situation with heartwood is that oftentimes the vessels get plugged with minerals and they get crushed in time such that water can't transfer up and down through the heartwood. So it occurs in the xylem. Sometimes you hear this called as sapwood. So cambium is also dividing in the spring to produce phloem. Now, phloem is nothing more than new bark, and the function of phloem is to carry the sugar that's produced in the crown of the tree and transports it down to feed the balance of the tree all the way down to the roots. And so because that's going down, we say flow low, xy high, flow low. Old phloem then becomes bark, and the function of the bark is just protection. It's dead, it doesn't carry sugars, and it will slough off. Each year I'll get calls from people concerned because about this time of the year, you get some high winds when trees are growing fast, and this bark will pop loose in the high wind, and they'll be concerned because there's bark around the base of the tree, and that shouldn't be a concern in most cases. So if you look at it a little bit more enlarged, it would look like that. There's that cambial zone. There's your xylem, these long straws, and there's your phloem right there, xylem and phloem. So one additional thing regarding wounds of trees, I like to say that trees never heal when they're wounded. They never heal, at least not like you and I do. They hide their problems. And so here's a situation where a tree was damaged by some equipment. And then you begin to see the first year's growth, second year's growth. Of course, you can see the growth rings, third, fourth. By the fifth year, it finally seals off, but that wound will always be with the tree. It's just compartmentalized, it stays with it. By the sixth year, it just becomes a bump on a log. But many sawmills are very proud of the things that have been encapsulated inside the wood, whether it be fences or horseshoes or bowling balls for that matter, that have been stuck in a tree and just grown around it. Sometimes the wounds, of course, are so great, this tree is trying to seal it off, but chances are that that might not make it, and wind will eventually catch that tree and blow it over. So moving on then, to understand how trees die, we must first understand the process by which they grow, by which they live. And so we examine that branch of science that explains the function of living organisms and their parts. And we know that more specifically as physiology, so tree physiologists. Dr. Jennifer Franklin is our tree physiologist in the Department of Forestry, Wildlife, and Fisheries, and she's going to know this in a great deal more than what I would. So the major physiological processes in trees that we're going to cover today, there are four, and each one has way too many syllables. Photosynthesis, which many of you probably remember that term. You might not remember respiration or transpiration or even translocation. So that's what we're going to look at as we advance through this. We begin with photosynthesis. Well, photosynthesis is nothing more than the conversion of sun's energy into food. And more specifically, the food would be considered sugar, and even more specifically, it's the carbohydrate sugar. And even more specifically, then it looks like this. That little molecule right there runs the world, C6H12O6. We all rely on carbohydrates for our survival, and so do trees. But what I want to make too is that fertilizer is not tree food. In talking with homeowners through the years, they might make the comment that they fertilize their tree. They say they fed the tree with fertilizer. And I sort of chuckle at that, thinking, well, you can't really feed a tree. A tree feeds itself, of course, by producing its own food. So fertilizer is not tree food. Now, if you'll bear with me through this, we're going to struggle through a chemical equation here. So photosynthesis is the combining of 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. So we learned that early on in school, that trees take in carbon dioxide. But when that carbon dioxide is mixed with water, 6 molecules of water, and this is all in the presence of sunlight, something miraculous happens. The product is The product is two things: the carbohydrate molecule, there's that molecule, plus oxygen that of course we all rely on every day. So this is the building block right there that runs the world. And this is really what the tree's after. Give it a break sometimes. That's really what it's after. In fact, so are the insects that feed on trees. That's what they're after, is this sugar molecule that trees produce. So this is the building block. Now, the window of opportunity for, I'm talking about hardwood trees, which represent about 87% of Tennessee's forests. The window of opportunity for these deciduous trees to produce carbohydrates is very short. It must be done in only about 5 months out of the year, and for only about 6 to 8 hours per day. And so trees have to be pretty efficient in this, because out of the 1,000 hours, they must produce the food that's going to then go on and feed that tree for 87 hours in a given year. So keep that in mind. So this is a conceptual seasonal carbohydrate production, just a relative graph that shows that this is the period that the tree has to produce its food. So it has to be very good at doing that. It must produce enough food to carry the tree for an entire 12 months. And then if you look at it on a daily production, the photosynthetic rate increases until such point that the temperature gets too high, as we'll explain shortly, and then it shuts off. And so that's why I say, obviously, photosynthesis is not occurring at night because there's no sunlight. That's one of the inputs. And it doesn't occur either when it gets really hot, because what's going to happen is these stomas, as I'll explain, close. And without water coming, then photosynthesis can't occur. So this is one of the take-home visuals that I want to share with you as we get started. This is the 5 seasons of the year. If you'll bear with me here, the 5 seasons of the year. And the darker the tree, the more photosynthate or carbohydrate reserves it has. And so I'm going to begin with season 4, which is late summer. And so as you would expect, at the end of the growing season, a tree should be plush with carbohydrates, because those carbohydrates are going to be used to sustain the growth of the tree through the winter months. And so as we get into winter, then the carbs then are stored in the roots and in the buds, in the trunk to a certain extent. In other words, the tree will convert this carbohydrate to a starch and then store it. And of course, that's why deer and squirrels and other forms of wildlife eat buds in the winter time, because that's where the energy is. So it stores it. But then as you get into early spring, carbs are then pulled back up toward the branches to prepare for leaf emergence. So you can see that as number 1 there. And that's where we're at right now, at least in West Tennessee. I assume out your direction as well. These carbs are being pulled up, so the tree is replenishing these carbohydrates. Why? Because leaf emergence is fixing to occur. And when that happens, of course, it takes a whole lot of energy. And that energy is depleted by spring. After leaf emergence, the carbs have been depleted. They are not yet fully beginning to photosynthesize again. So the last thing that we want during this phase of the year would be a late frost. And many of you probably remember the late frost that we had in 2007. And the results of that, after the leaves have emerged, I know in West Tennessee, we had 3 nights where we reached 16 degrees in temperature. And that, of course, caused the leaves to die, essentially. And the tree had to draw upon depleted carb reserves to flush again. And so as summer begins, then the tree is replenishing these depleted carbs, and hopefully life is resuming for the tree. So that kind of gives you a picture of how the carbs kind of move throughout the tree throughout the course of a year. This is just to make sure that you're staying awake. Let's all sing our song. So, yeah, photosynthesis is the process that produces the carbohydrate. Then respiration is the process that then breaks it back down. And so respiration is the oxidation or the using up of this energy, the carbohydrates that have been produced, to provide energy to keep these living cells alive and to fuel the growth. So respiration then is photosynthesis essentially in reverse order. If you looked at it chemically, that's about what it amounts to. They build the carbon up, and then they break the carbon back down to keep the cells alive. Respiration. So photosynthesis, as we have established, is seasonal. In most cases, it's about 1,000 hours a year for, at least for the deciduous trees. But respiration occurs all year long, all 8,760 hours of the year. And so, as you would expect then, this rate of photosynthesis must exceed the rate of respiration, because without a surplus of carbohydrates, then a deficit, of course, is going to occur. Tree vigor then will decline, and eventually mortality will result if they're not producing enough of these carbohydrates to accommodate the needs for respiration. So a few points to ponder then as we continue here. We must minimize all activities that could hinder this carbohydrate production. If it's that important, we should become very careful as we're working in or around trees, some things to avoid. And I like to say, kind of in joking form, that we really should never prune. And I'll let you finish your gasp when I say that. The removal of healthy photosynthesizing limbs is probably, we shouldn't be doing, but having said that, I've done it all the time. I've pruned a lot of trees. And of course, there's another number of reasons why we do that. Sometimes it's safety, sometimes it's to address a view or just an issue around other trees that you're trying to grow, shrubbery and so forth. But if we're going to prune, let's prune in late winter. Most people, oftentimes the common homeowner, they get out their mower in the spring of the year and they finally decide, you know, I'm going to prune that limb that bothered me all last year. And so they prune during the summer months. That's exactly what you don't want to do. We don't want to prune while a tree is actively growing, because there's going to be good sap flow. The sap is going to attract insects. Insects become vectors for diseases that can harm the tree. And likewise, we don't want to prune either in the fall of the year, because that's when many of the funguses are producing their spores that are flying around. If they land on a fresh wound, it might affect the tree next year. But by late winter, of course, the sap has gone dormant, and the fungus spores have also settled out. So that's the best time to prune. I like to say January, February, maybe up through about early March, and that's about it. We also, of course, want to avoid damage to the cambium for obvious reasons. That's where the xylem and phloem originates, and you can cut off the flow of that pretty rapidly. Soil compaction is something that we oftentimes don't consider, but soil compaction is going to hinder that fine root development and the function of the fine roots. And I'll show you what I mean by that shortly, but that's something we certainly want to avoid, whether it's foot traffic or compaction with equipment around construction sites and so forth. And then finally, obviously, we want to avoid damage to the root system, particularly the severing of the roots. So this is the second take-home visual that I want to provide for you. We've got two views of a tree stump, essentially. The top view, and you can see, of course, the trunk of the tree. These are the lateral roots, and then these are those root fans or those root hairs that emerge. If you look at that from the side view, it's the same thing, the trunk and the lateral roots. But notice how these root fans, these fine roots, grow toward the surface. And if you look at our yard settings, of course, everybody's kind of obsessed with trying to establish grass in yard settings, but that's very competitive with tree roots, particularly if it's something like fescue or your warm season grasses. So these fine roots grow toward the surface, trying to procure water, trying to procure oxygen and fertility or nutrients as well, but they're competing with grass. And so what do we do to our yard trees? We throw a little mulch around the base of it. And not to trivialize this, but I like to personify trees. And I think a tree looks down at that and says, well, now, isn't that interesting? What is it really accomplishing? When you look at these fine roots that are way out here, really the only thing we've done here is make our yards look more attractive, and perhaps it protected the tree from weed eater blight. But I guess some of you are saying, is he smack talking mulch? No, I guess what I'm saying is, how much of the forest is mulched? It's all mulch. So if we're going to mulch, let's mulch. Let's do something that will really benefit the trees. Now, some of you might be saying, well, what kind of a person would do that? Well, actually, I did. I've done that before. Now, this happens to be the first house that I moved into in Tennessee 23 years ago. And just prior to moving in, the city of Jackson actually cut a 4-foot culvert that went from here to here. And upon finding that out, I didn't realize that at the time that I purchased the property, but I realized we were going to have problems. A 4-foot culvert on a tree that size was going to lead to problems. And so I actually used poor man's mulch here. This was straw, but any kind of organic matter, whether it be leaves or bark mulch, should be sufficient. Of course, the key is we don't want it to be deep. It should be shallow but wide, And this went out about 32 feet, as I recall. But you see, even on this old tree, that some decline was beginning to happen. Some of that primary growth was beginning to decline on that tree by the time that I got to it. So I was concerned about the tree might have to be taken down. And I contacted a local tree trimmer and got an estimate of $3,500 to remove that tree. And so instead of taking the tree down, I just sold the house and moved on. So the next home we moved into then had trees already established by the previous owner. So that encouraged me. They were young, I could work with them. But immediately I was, of course, concerned about these warm season grass that was around the base of it. So I began a process of actually killing the trees. This was sprayed with a 2% solution of Roundup, excuse me, not killing the trees, killing the grass, sprayed with a 2% solution of Roundup. And then immediately my neighbor across the street put his house up for sale because he thought, what's this guy up to? But what I did was I killed the grass and then I covered with mulch and planted pink dogwoods underneath these trees. And then every few years, I would expand this ring another 2 feet as it went. And by the time we got done, we had something that was pretty attractive. You can see how much the trees had grown just in 7 years. They liked this. The trees were happy. Again, how much of the forest is mulched? It's all mulch. So trees like mulch. That's a good thing. They're not used to competition from grass sod. So keep that in mind. Well, we're going to move on and moving right along here. We begin the third physiological process, and that's transpiration. And that's the process of water passing from the tree back into the atmosphere. And mostly this occurs through the stomas in the leaves, the stomas in the leaves. So small pores in the leaves are called stomas, and they open and they close to regulate both gas exchange and water movement, and thus tree growth. And so this would be a stoma that's open. It is transpiring, water would be passing through that, and this would be a stoma that would be closed. And so stomas are closed for a number of reasons, but typically if they're losing water faster than it can be replaced, they're going to close that to try to preserve the water. And of course, they're closed when it gets hot as well. So transpiration is active on the left, it ceases on the right. And there's a stoma with 2 guard cells on the leaf surface to give you an idea of what a stoma might look like microscopic. Well, the mechanism of water movement in a tree is quite simple. It goes from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration, no different than a paper towel in a puddle of water, or for that matter, a sponge, very similar. And so as leaf cells dry, they pull additional water from below, constantly going upward. And so the transpiration rate then depends on low humidity, high wind, and high temperature will increase the rate of transpiration until such time that it shuts down, as you might imagine. So let's talk a little bit about carbohydrates. They are produced, of course, in the leaves. Then they are transported to the stem, the trunk, and the roots via the phloem cells for use. But the question becomes, well, who gets the carbohydrates first? Is there a priority order in this distribution? And there is, and we're going to talk about that in translocation. So translocation is the piping system that distributes the food. The piping system that distributes the food. And so through translocation, trees allocate these carbohydrates to support 5 different processes, and they are in priority order. So the first sugar that's being produced, as you can imagine, has to go to keeping living cells alive. So that's respiration. Think of it sort of like our digestion, essentially. And so the trees are going to keep their living cells alive. Now, if there's any sugar left over after that, and there better be, then the tree says, okay, we will now allocate this sugar, the carbohydrates, to the fine root production. Those are those root fans. And of course, again, we tend to overlook them because they're small, but they're very, very important to the tree because of what they do, the procurement of water and nutrients and oxygen. So certainly the last thing that we want to do if we're dealing with the trees in the yard is to bring a tiller in and try to establish either grass or shrub, other types of shrubbery, and just till up and tear up those root fans. We don't want that. Again, just the fact that moles and voles eat roots, these fine roots tells you there must be energy there. So then, the tree is taking care of its respiration. It's taking care of the fine roots. If there's any sugar left over after all that, and there better be, the tree will send it into flower and seed production. And so as you can imagine, a lot of energy is required to produce the flower and then to plumpen up the seed. You ask why we eat apples and bananas and walnuts. It's because that's where the energy is. That's where the carbohydrates are. It takes a lot of that to produce those. So trees are no different than any other organism. They want to grow and they want to reproduce. So if there's any carbohydrates then left over after these three, it goes into primary growth. So primary growth is the elongation of branches and roots. So a tree essentially is saying, okay, I've taken care of 1, 2, and 3. We can now afford to go out and find a new piece of sky and a new piece of earth. We can expand that primary growth on the tips. A tree will say, we can now afford to expand, because they don't want to. If in fact the health of the tree is not good, it will tend to hold its resources in. That's primary growth. I oftentimes compare it to an employee. When an employee gets a raise, sometimes it might be a good raise, and you begin to ask, well, what can we use with this? What can we do with these extra funds? Get the second car, take a vacation, maybe re-roof the house that you've been. In other words, we can now afford to do more. And that's what the tree is saying. I can now afford to do more to grow. Now then, if there's any food left over, any sugar left over after all this, it finally gets down to what I as a forester am interested in, and that's secondary growth. And that's the growth in diameter. In other words, it's wood fiber. So everyone here is familiar with the growth rings on trees. We count trees and age the tree. I don't think of these as growth rings. I call it interest rate. So from a timber production standpoint, the faster I can make this tree grow, the quicker we can turn that rotation around and help the landowner, generate revenue as they're growing trees. Because you say, well, why is that important? Well, if my goal as a forester is to make sure that we're going to have trees for the future, then I have to compete with everything else that's trying to utilize the forest, whether it's clearing it for row crop production or using it for livestock or even development for that matter. If I can't compete with those things, then the landowner will say, well, I'm going to convert it to these other things that do generate revenue. So that's where the secondary growth from the forester standpoint is very important. Well, in a healthy tree then, each of these 5 processes are sufficiently fueled by carbohydrates. So life is flush. In other words, allocating the carbohydrates I was talking about. But gradual mortality of a tree can be observed by examining these 5 processes in reverse order. In other words, the carbohydrates are being recalled. And so oftentimes as I'm called to come out and inspect a yard tree, one of the first things that I do is I slam my car doors. I look up to the very tip top of the tree that I'm examining. That's the first thing I look at, because if I see mortality on the tips of the tree, that's telling me that primary growth is no longer occurring and that the tree is pulling those resources in. And the next thing to suffer will be flower and fruit production. And then the next thing to suffer, of course, will be these fine root production. And then eventually, of course, respiration will cease. And so you can tell, and foresters actually can bore into a tree and count the growth rings and see when that secondary growth is declining as well. So the tree will essentially do this in reverse order. And if you're astute at observing this, you can tell when a tree is declining even before it's not clear that it's declining. So let's go back to that tree that was in my yard, and let's follow the carbohydrate recall on this particular tree. After I moved back, I would periodically swing by and take a quick picture of this thing to use it for educational programs, and also to see if my theory was correct that this tree was dying. And so if we look at the tree here, about the time we moved out, and look at it now, we're no longer living at that house, but you can clearly see the carbohydrate recall on that side of the tree where it's damaged, where that full 4-foot culvert was cut in. 2005, 2011. If you look at the biomass on each side of this line, you can clearly see the biomass is declining on the left side of that line in a 6-year period. So it was gradual. It was more gradual than I thought it would. I haven't been back in a few years to see how it's doing, but if it's even still standing. So I guess what I'm getting at is that think of it as a carbohydrate balance. When a tree is young, it's producing more carbohydrates than it essentially needs, and it puts it into that secondary growth of the trunk. So you see the trunk growing very rapidly. It's producing more essentially than it needs. But as a tree begins to mature, it balances out. What it produces, it is using. So it's kind of an equal production and equal utilization. But then as a tree begins to age, the living tissue in the tree is very great, but the amount of carbohydrates that are being produced begins to shrink. And that's when a decline can occur in the tree. When it's using more carbohydrates than it's actually producing, that's of course not sustainable. Well, I've sort of described a kind of a gradual process of a tree dying, but tree mortality is not always gradual. Sometimes it occurs very rapidly through some type of mechanical disruption. And I'm just going to give you 3 examples of situations that can kill a tree pretty fast. And the first is, of course, severing the cambium of the tree. Now, some of you might be saying, well, why would we want to do that? And in a yard setting, you probably wouldn't want to do that. But in a forest setting, we do on occasion come in and actually kill trees. And the whole goal is to shift the growth of unwanted trees over to the wanted trees, the desirable trees, so that the desirable trees will grow faster and we can have more frequent harvesting. We call this, excuse me, crop tree release or timber stand improvement. And so particularly on trees that are about 12 inches in diameter and less, a double girdle method without chemical is normally going to kill that tree. And so water can continue to go up. They circumvent these girdles and make it up to the crown of the tree. And sometimes the leaves will continue to produce sugar, but as it comes down, the sugar has a very difficult, it's very difficult for them to try to bridge this gap. Larger trees, it can happen. I've seen it on large beech and hickory, and they just keep right on growing. And so that's why we may have to add some herbicide to that ring to kill it. But that can kill a tree fairly quickly. Another example, of course, would be root damage or massive soil, some compaction, where you just cut this off and eliminates a source of water, particularly during the growing season. That can kill a tree pretty fast. And then even damage or the loss of larger limbs, as you I'm sure clearly understand, that's the food factory. And if you lose roughly a third of that crown or more, you can damage a tree pretty quickly and kill it fairly quickly, depending on what kind of condition it was in prior to the damage. So we get back to the original question, and that is, why do trees die? And the simple answer is that trees die because respiration stops. And respiration stops because carbohydrate production stops. And carbohydrate production stops because photosynthesis stops, and that stops because any of these 6 factors that are necessary for photosynthesis are obstructed or they're just eliminated. And that includes sunlight, water, nutrients. You see many of these in the photosynthesis equation: temperature, carbon dioxide, and water. But of these six, more often than not, what's going to kill a tree in the end is going to be water. More than 80% of the variation in tree growth is because of water supply. We've gone through a number of physiological processes, and water is necessary for all of that. So without water or too much water, that can kill a tree. So in yard settings, water oftentimes, as I mentioned, is the single most limiting factor. And why is that? Well, oftentimes we're dealing with harsh soils. Many of our homes are constructed in subdivisions, on streets and so forth, that at one time was used for row cropping or livestock pasture. And those soils, topsoil oftentimes is gone. You're down to the subsoil. It's a hard pan, which makes it difficult for trees to penetrate. And so harsh soils oftentimes is one of the reasons. Sod competition can be another one why water is limiting. Certainly there's microclimates in our yard settings. We've got hard, hot, impermeable surfaces. We've got a lot of actual asphalt, concrete that causes water to run off fast. Instead of reaching the tree, it gets off the site too quickly. And then, of course, just a whole host of human influences that can affect water availability in a tree. So the top reasons for tree mortality then, and I call these the sassy 7, and that's drought, which we covered a lot today, soil compaction, of course, poor species selection, which is another presentation in itself, but oftentimes people go to a nursery, they pick up a tree and bring it back and then decide where they're going to plant it. It should be just the opposite. You study the site first and you match the tree to that site, working with an arborist, a forester, a horticulturist, somebody that knows something about the requirements of each species, wet sites, dry sites, and so forth. Of course, storms and winds, number 4, will take out a number of trees, as will insects. Although insects get a lot of bad publicity, the ones you really need to watch out for are the wood boring beetles. Those are the ones that bore in that insecticides have a hard time killing. Once they're in there, then of course they're just after the sugar that's in that cambium region too, but they can cut it off just like cutting off a straw essentially and prevent water from getting up, sugar from getting down. Herbicides can kill trees, although I think they get blamed far too often for tree mortality in yard settings. Many of the people in this audience today are probably licensed and they know how to use herbicides safely. But still, it is a concern. And then competition with other trees. We plant trees and in time, they begin to shade each other out. People wonder why my dogwood is no longer flowering. It used to flower. Well, maybe it's because it's just become too shaded. And remember, trees have to allocate that sugar away from flower and fruit production toward respiration. And that's why they're no longer flowering. Of course, that can eventually lead to mortality, too much shade for some species of trees. So for good yard tree health, I like to say, kill the grass under the tree, start a trend in your neighborhood and do that and mulch as wide as you can, not deep, but wide. Water when necessary. Hopefully you've planted trees that don't require a lot of watering, trees that are native to the sites that's being planted on and can tolerate it. Fertilize only as needed. Fertilizer is something I think that's overrated. We need to do a soil test first and see if it's necessary. Trees are pretty hardy. They can tolerate a wide range for pH. Roughly 5.5 to about 6.2 is the range for many species. And normally our yards will fall in that pH range. Of course, protect the trees from equipment and soil compaction and root damage. And anytime you're doing any type of construction, prune only when necessary or beneficial and use sterilized tools. Just spray your tools down with Lysol, that's sufficient. And then regulate the spacing too. We plant, as I said, too many trees in the yard, and in time, everything fills in and you've got too many trees. So that can lead to problems. So, and then finally, of course, think like a tree. When you're working on or around trees, think like a tree. And so I conclude with a reminder that this presentation and many others, go to YouTube and type in Back Porch Forestry, subscribe if you'd like. This presentation, a longer version of it is in this publication that you see here, Why Do Trees Die? And there's the URL for that. But if you just type in that title, Why Do Trees Die, my last name, you'll find it anyway. So that concludes the presentation part of it. We've got a few questions or time for questions, I guess. And I'll go back to Alyssa to see what she's got to say.
Thank you. That was awesome. I know there are a lot of industry folks on here, but as a layperson, I learned so much. And yes, we have time for questions. Reminder to put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself if you want. We've got a couple that I will read out now. Does the age of a tree impact its physiology? For example, a young tree or sapling versus older mature trees?
I think so. Again, I like to personify trees, and there's no question when trees begin slowing down as they age that many of these processes are going to begin to suffer, and they might have been able to tolerate, for instance, the southern pine beetle attacks pine trees. Young, healthy, vigorous growing trees can push that beetle back out with its sap flow. But as trees age or they become overstocked, there's not good sap flow. And so the beetles are able to bore in and essentially swim against the current of the sap and kill that tree pretty rapidly. So yeah, there's no question that as trees age, I think they're more susceptible to problems.
Okay, one more in the chat. One of my young trees was defoliated by insects during midsummer. The tree then sprouted new shoots at its base. Did it have time to replenish carb production?
Well, depending on the timing of it. Okay, a typical scenario is that the leaves will fall off and then dormant buds will reflush if there's enough dormant buds on the stems. But you can imagine the tree's in shock, and so it's pulling its resources down, and it may have to reflush from the base, in other words. In which case, I wouldn't be in any hurry to prune off the dead limbs. Allow the tree to completely pull those resources down until you're sure that it snaps off, it's dead, and then you can prune off the dead branches. And of course, you're left with a number of sprouts around the base of the tree. And in time, you'll want to favor probably one or more of those trees. Something else I want to stress is that when this does happen, when a tree defoliates and has to reflush during the growing season like this, it's important to give it water, because water is necessary for the movement of these whole carbohydrates and to allow photosynthesis to resume. And so if you remember the frost that we had in 2007, 3 nights we hit 16 degrees. The last thing we needed during that summer was a drought, and we did have that. So trees are trying to reflush. They needed water, and it wasn't there. And I knew that the following year, 2008, we were going to start getting calls from a lot of people from trees dying, and that's exactly what happened.
Okay, anyone else have some questions? Those are all that are currently in the chat.
Okay.
Alicia, can you hear me?
Yes.
I was going to ask David, first let me preface this, that a lot of folks in our cities feel a very strong attachment to their trees, especially the older ones. Mm-hmm. And they may not know, they may hang on to that tree way beyond the time it should have been removed, if that makes sense. And is there a point of no return that a homeowner or a city manager could look at, that this tree is now is a risk, or that some action needs to be taken to remove it?
Yes, there is a point of no return. Knowing when to pull that trigger is very challenging, though, Neil. Of course, there's things that can be done to trees to perpetuate the growth, or at least allow them to grow longer, I guess what I'm saying. They can be injected with fertilizers. I encourage you to mulch, like I talk about, fertilize if it's necessary, whether it's injected or even through the ground. You might remove dead limbs. Oftentimes that's more of a safety concern than it is a tree health concern, but sometimes that might prevent a tree from blowing over if they've been thinned out, the crowns have been thinned out. But again, what I try to tell people to do is look at the tips. That's one thing that everybody can do, is look at the tips, the new growth. Sometimes you can reach the new growth and actually see that over the course of the year, it used to grow, 18 inches a year. Now it's 12, now it's 6, now it's 3, now it's 2. And then eventually you've got branch tips that are dying back. We call that stag-headed, dead branches on the tip. That's something that the homeowner can do. But there's a point where there's nothing you can do but just hang on. And the question becomes, well, do I want to continue spending money on this tree when taking it down is inevitable? And I can't tell you when that is. But I know, to me, security plays in first. If it's a danger of that tree, falling on structures, people, car, whatever, that's going to rank higher than if it's out kind of by itself in the middle of the yard.
Jim Webster put in the chat, can you speak to fire damage?
Oh boy. Yeah. Of course, prescribed fire is something that foresters and wildlife biologists do in the woods on a regular basis. That's oftentimes for wildlife concerns. Obviously, the hotter the fire is and the more frequent it is, that's when it's going to cause lasting damage to the tree. Oftentimes, at least in a forest setting, the fires, the convection carries the flames uphill and the heat uphill. And as it reaches a tree, the flames eddy around a tree, much like a water around a rock in a stream. And it gets very hot on the uphill side of the tree. And that's where you tend to find the scorching. Now, a little bit of blackening of the bark isn't necessarily bad. It's whether or not that cambium has been damaged on the inside. And of course, the thicker the bark of the tree, the less likely it is to have damaged that cambium. And so thin bark trees, young trees with hot fire situations can be detrimental. And so it's a fine line. I know in some people that do prescribe burning on a regular basis, their woods, they might take a rake and actually rake the leaves away from the base of the tree so that the flames don't build up and kill the cambium. Of course, that's a lot of work, but it's something if you're dedicated that you might want to do. I was brought up in the Smoky Bear area and went through forestry school when fire was bad. And so the line of thinking has changed somewhat on that there is a place for fire in our natural settings if it's done by professionals.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, do we have any more questions?
Nothing currently in the chat.
Well, just to give folks another minute or two, and David, I always like to digest what I've heard and boil it down into take-home points. And what you've inspired me to consider is that first, we need to understand how trees really work. And I think you've really done a great job of laying that out. The more we understand how trees work, the better we are able to assess its condition and actually take care of it. And then secondly, you've inspired us to try to recreate a natural forest setting wherever possible. And I liked your idea about expanding the mulch bed around the root system. That's one way that people can do that. And then obviously, 3, we need to prevent human damage to our trees and not make a situation worse by our activities. That example you gave in the house you used to live in was excellent. But, you know, 4th, despite all we do, I think we need to realize that not all that all trees will eventually die. And we need to be able to recognize the signs and symptoms of that decline and when we need to take action to remove and to replace it with a younger tree. So for me, that's the take-home points, and I appreciate your presentation. I know everybody else does, and I think we may be contacting you for maybe a future topic. So you might want to be on your toes, and if you have something, a topic you think would be relevant to us, we'd love to give you a platform here. But thank you.
Glad to help, and I thank you for this opportunity.
Okay. Well, Lisa, why don't we give folks a heads up on to next month's presentation. We're going to pull from the UT, University of Tennessee again, the School of Forestry and Wildlife Sciences. Maddie Johnson, a master's candidate, is going to give a talk on some research that she has done on evaluating the potential for restoration of riparian buffers in East Tennessee communities. Now, I will say that this has applications statewide. Riparian buffers, those streams that are the arteries of a watershed system, are essential in our urban areas, and sometimes they're mismanaged. And there's a lot of interest in trying to repair those through plantings and streamside management zones, restoring the native vegetation for cleaner water and stormwater runoff. Maddie has done some research and evaluation on the state of riparian buffers in East Tennessee and some activities that can be taken to try to restore those into their natural function. And I think this applies to all of our Tennessee residents. So if you're interested in this in your community on how you can restore riparian buffer or riparian streams in your community, you'll want to sit in on this free webinar featuring Maddie Johnson. And once again, we're going to apply for ISA CEU approval. It has not been approved yet, but I expect it will be. So with that, I want to thank all of you for attending. I want to thank our speaker, Dr. David Mercker, for an outstanding presentation. And we hope to see you next month on May 19th. Thank you.